So Matthew, thank you so much again for being here and doing this event for us. So what I wanted to do to kind of begin the discussion is just pose a couple of questions to you. And then after that, we're going to kick it out to the audience so that they can ask questions about, what was discussed and so forth. So I think the first question that we want to ask you is, obviously, as Jolene was saying, part of the inspiration, for doing this event were the events of January 6th and the storming of the Capitol that, was quite a spectacle and caught many folks off guard. So I was wondering, to start off, if you could talk to us a little bit about, okay, in the events of January 6th, what organizations of the far right were representative? And can you speak a little bit about what different ideas and political goals these organizations have? Thanks.
Sure. And first of all, let me just say thank you, Kyle and Jolene, and to all the organizers, and thank you to everybody who's here with us in this event. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. So in terms of what kind of organizations and political currents were involved in the January 6th action, there were a number. I mean, I count at least half a dozen different political currents, and I should say, I mean, first of all, that when we're talking about January 6th, it wasn't just one event. I mean, there was a rally that took place that Trump addressed via big screen, and then there was a march to the Capitol, and then there was the invasion of the U.S. Capitol itself. So mainly going to talk about who was involved in the Capitol, but it's all of a piece to some degree. And the other thing, just in general, is that as far as we know, the majority of people who took part in the attack on the Capitol building were not affiliated with specific far-right organizations, and although they may have had specific leanings, but it was largely people who were part of a broader kind of unorganized movement of Trump supporters. But in terms of the more organized and distinctly far-right section, I mean, first of all, you had white nationalists, and by white nationalists, I mean particularly people who not only espouse an explicitly racist ideology, but actually want to create an all-white nation, either in the United States as a whole or some subsection of it. And these groups that were involved at January 6th include groups like the Patriot Front and Groypers. It's an odd name, but it's a group that sprung up a few years ago in an effort to kind of make white nationalism look more respectable. But I would say, excuse me, one of the currents that represented kind of a larger section of the gathering was folks affiliated with the so-called Patriot Movement, groups such as the Oath Keepers and various groups using the name 3 Percenters. And Patriot Movement groups, I mean, they have kind of different political leanings to some extent, but they tend to be groups that have this fear that globalist elites are involved in a conspiracy to impose some kind of a tyrannical government in the United States. It's a movement that is really influenced by various different ideological currents within the far right. There is an influence of white nationalism and a more sort of explicit racist or white supremacist leaning, but the more common or at least on the national level, more common orientation in terms of race politics is actually color blindness. It's the idea that, you know, we're all Americans, we don't see color, quote unquote, which I would say is it's a different kind of ideology that supports racial oppression, in the sense that it protects the system of racial hierarchy by denying that it's there. And in the case of groups such as Oath Keepers and Three Percenters, it is often, or even usually, combined with demonization and scapegoating of immigrants, Muslims, Black Lives Matter activists, and you know, other groups rooted in communities of color. But it is certainly distinct from the explicit white supremacism and white nationalism of some other groups. Another group that it's sort of in a category by itself, but has gotten a lot of attention, is the Proud Boys. This is it's an all-male organization that was founded a few years ago, that has been involved in really very actively promoting and provoking violence against various opponents. I mean, they, you know, just kind of a number of occasions have just kind of roamed around looking for people to pick fights with, you know, as well as getting into violent clashes at demonstrations. And the Proud Boys, again, it has a somewhat different orientation than what we think of as sort of standard white supremacist or white nationalist politics, although they have a lot of friendly relations with white nationalists. But the Proud Boys refer to themselves as Western chauvinists. So it's what I think of as a kind of a cultural racism, in the sense that they're not saying that, you know, anybody who is you know, of non-European origin is you know, we don't want to have anything to do with. And in fact, the Proud Boys include significant membership by people of color, including their leader, who is identifies as Afro-Cuban. But certainly in terms of the notion that, you know, the West is the best, is, you know, this phrase they use, and it sort of in a cultural sense, that the European heritage is something to be celebrated above other backgrounds. But this is combined very much with very active misogyny and homophobia and other kinds of scapegoating, transphobia, and also anti-communism, I think, is a major theme of theirs. Moving on, the QAnon network is another current that has been very active among the larger Trump support movement, and was certainly very much involved in the events of January 6th. And QAnon is not an organization; it's more of a network or a subculture, and it promotes a number of conspiracy theories and centers on sort of spinning out very elaborate and you know, very sort of fantastical conspiracy theories. The central one being, I guess, that there is a plot of satanic pedophiles who control the Democratic Party and have, you know, various positions of power within the state and other major institutions, and they saw Trump, President Trump, as kind of championing the efforts of to expose and defeat and destroy this satanic conspiracy. And you know, conspiracism, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about it more later, but it's certainly something that's been around in this country and elsewhere for a long time as part of right-wing ideology. And the QAnon conspiracy theories are very much rooted in anti-Semitic traditions and homophobic traditions and other kinds of conspiracist currents. And many people have described it as kind of a quasi-religious kind of a movement. And speaking of religious, Another current that has, I would say, not gotten as much attention in this connection is the Christian right. And uh, the um, the lead up to the events of January 6th, in terms of the movement to claim that the election was fraudulent and that Trump had been robbed of the victory. One of the organizations that was very heavily involved in that was a group called Jericho March, which was founded by uh, people within the Christian right, and promotes a very Christian right kind of ideology. And another subset of the Christian right that has been very much involved in and was also present at least at the Trump rally before the Capitol attack, was the New Apostolic Reformation movement, which is a section of the Christian right that has a very explicitly theocratic agenda. I mean, they say that they want to take control of the government and all major institutions in the name of their particular vision of um, biblical teaching. And as with many sections of the Christian right, in practical terms, the ideology tends to focus on issues of gender and sexuality more than on race. I mean, certainly they have, they promote, I would say, a cultural racism in various ways, but the center in terms of what they mobilize people around tends to be around issues such as opposing abortion rights, reproductive rights, opposing LGBTQ rights, and things like this. And they vary in terms of their ethnic and racial makeup. Some Christian right groups are very heavily white or all white, but others have significant multi-ethnic and multiracial makeup, including the New Apostolic Reformation. And then lastly, I would say that involved in January 6th, you also had just a lot of kind of different, more or less single issue kinds of groups. So people who had been mobilized around the so-called anti-lockdown movement, in this past spring, of people claiming that public health measures were around the coronavirus pandemic, that these were somehow anti-American and tyrannical. People involved in the climate denial movement. A straight pride group, so-called, under the curious name Super Happy Fun America. This is a group that has organized a so-called straight pride march in Boston a couple of years ago. So again, these are groups that wouldn't necessarily qualify as far right per se, but were part of this kind of larger, broadly pro-Trump movement that, in many cases, people will be involved in more than one of these different currents, but they do have sort of distinct ideological and organizational profiles. I think that covers, all the major ones that I'm aware of. So back to you.
Thank you so much for that, very thorough response. I think you made a couple of really, I think, interesting points that I wanted to kind of follow up on. And the first is, I think that, this event in January, like we were saying, it's kind of put some of these organizations in the limelight to an extent. But I think it's also important to note that these politics aren't really that new. And in American society, they've always been in the mix and have appeared in certain moments, in our history, and played a real role politically. And so I was wondering if you could speak to a bit of the history and the evolution of these groups, and even the kind of past influences that they've had within right-wing politics in American society from the past.
I will. I'll give a short answer. I mean, because you could you could write whole books about that. But I guess the first thing I want to say is that, as you say, these there's a long history, there's a long backstory to these, and in the very broad sense, the kinds of supremacist and exclusionary politics that far right forces represent are very much rooted in the structure of society. They're rooted in the existing not only traditions, political traditions or ideological traditions, but rooted in actual systems of power and oppression and exploitation that have defined U.S. society from the beginning. And so in that sense, you can find forerunners of the various different threads at many different points in U.S. history. I find that looking at like the last half century, 50 or 60 years, is kind of a helpful chunk to trace some of the main trajectories of sort of how did we get to this point right now, and I tend to look at the far right in a way that's a little bit atypical. People typically define far right in terms of a particular ideology, and as my answer to the previous question indicated, I see a lot of different ideological currents that they interact, but they're really kind of distinct. And so to me, the way that I find most useful to define the far right is it's two things. First of all, they are movements that in one way or another regard social inequality, whether that's in terms of race or gender or some other lines, regard social inequality as either natural or inevitable or desirable, something to be promoted and celebrated. And they also reject the legitimacy of the existing political system. So it's, you can have white supremacist politics and say, we want to, ensure that white people are in, power and dominant, but we'll do that within the framework that exists, versus other groups that say, we want to create an all-white nation, or we want to create, if we're talking in religious terms, we want to create a Christian theocracy, something like this. So it's a notion of the far right that cuts across these ideological categories, and it reflects what I see as a real historical shift that took place about 50 years ago, where in response to the changes that happened in and around the 1960s, such as the overthrow of Jim Crow segregation, the major changes in immigration laws, and a number of other shifts, both in the legal system and in the broader culture in response to the Black liberation movement, the women's liberation movement, gay and lesbian struggles, and so on. In response to these, you had sections of the right, the political right, decided that they could no longer achieve their goals within the existing political framework. And this was clearest within the white supremacist movement. Up until the 1960s, groups like the Ku Klux Klan were basically trying to defend a system that was in place. And after that, some of that movement said, we are no longer about defending the existing order in this country. We reject loyalty to the United States government, to the system of government that we have, and we want to have a revolution. We want to create a different country. Either we want to just take over this whole country, or we want to split off from it. and some of them actually took up arms against the U.S. government. And and then you had comparable kinds of shifts within other right-wing currents. Over the past half century or so, we've seen, kind of a series of waves of rises and falls of activism by different sectors of the far right. I mean, white nationalism in its modern form kind of came together in the 70s and 1980s, and it was in the 80s that you saw a whole underground network of people who were literally waging war against the U.S. government, and that was suppressed by the Reagan administration and other state and local forces, but under the leadership of the Reagan administration. And then since then, you've had different versions of white nationalism that have risen and fallen in different ways. The Christian right, as a mass movement, kind of came together around the same time, 70s or 80s. And within that, you had a poll, sort of a majority that wanted to basically make changes within the existing political framework. But then you had a minority current that wanted to, as I said, create a full-blown theocracy. The Patriot Movement first kind of took on a mass character in the 1990s, and it has always been a kind of a meeting place for different currents. So it was very much influenced by white nationalism, but also very much influenced by the Christian right and by the libertarian movement. The Patriot Movement has always put a big emphasis on property rights as a kind of overarching theme that kind of unifies people who may have different politics around race and around religion. And it's also very much tied in with the gun rights movement and with the conspiracy theory tradition of groups like the John Birch Society from the 1950s and later. The Patriot Movement, as I said, was kind of first exploded in the 1990s, and then after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which was actually carried out by neo-Nazis, they blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City, killed 168 people. In the wake of that, there was a lot of moves to crack down on the Patriot Movement, and there was a lot of splits within it, and it kind of collapsed within a few years. But then after Obama was elected president in 2008, you saw a resurgence of the Patriot Movement kind of as a reaction to that and other events. I mean, it also had to do with the Great Recession and so on, but it was in large part a reaction to the election of an African American as president of the United States. There's been, different sections of the far right have been more prominent at different points, and they've shifted in terms of the particular kinds of strategies that they favored and the ways that they chose to organize and the ways that they chose to relate to more mainstream politics, whether it's within the Republican Party or other forces. So,
thanks. Kind of what you were saying at the end is, I think, tied into the next question that I wanted to ask, and this will probably be the last question that I do, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And that is, you've very clearly kind of outlined what you see as all these different groups that are in the mix. But at the same time, you very clearly said to start off that, in your view, this was a minority of people, for example, that took part in the January 6th events. So my question is, okay, we know that these organizations, they're claim to be against the system. You know, we know that some of them are trying to kind of orient themselves to Trump supporters and stuff like that. So my question is, what do you think the relationship of these kind of ideas are to the average Trump voter at this point?
Okay. Well, I think that you know, I mean, the average Trump voter is, you know, I mean, it's I'm sure significant diversity and variation in ways of thinking among Trump voters as there are among other, you know, sectors of the electorate. But you know, certainly as far as I see it, the the average Trump voters are not involved in the organized far right, as I said, and probably would, you know, be very skeptical of a lot of what, you know, the far right stands for. I think probably they would be more open to the politics of Patriot Movement groups or Christian right groups than to white nationalists, in the sense that, I mean, the kind of explicit white supremacism that white nationalists advocate is something that, you know, it's really been widely discredited in U.S. society, increasingly since the 1960s, whereas other kinds of racist ideologies, other ideologies that promote racial oppression, are still widely accepted and embraced, such as so-called color blindness, such as, you know, sort of more you know, subtler kinds of cultural racism, where you say, well, we're fine with having a few people of color involved as long as they kind of adhere to, you know, Eurocentric norms and expectations, right? Those kinds of racist ideologies are more widely accepted, and I think that's true not only among Trump voters, it's true among a lot of Democrats too, but I think it's true. It's certainly true of Trump voters. So, you know, that said, I think that many of the groups within the far right see Trump voters as a potential pool for recruitment, and that's been, you know, that's been true for, you know, throughout the period that Trump's been on the scene politically. But we're kind of in a different period now versus even just a few months ago. Because, I mean, earlier on I talked about how, you know, part of my definition of the far right is rejecting the legitimacy of the existing political system. Well, when Trump said that the election is a fraud, you know, that I have been robbed, that, you know, that Biden did not in fact win, you know, these kind of fraudulent claims that he's been making for months. And when literally tens of millions of people, if the polls are accurate, within the Republican Party and beyond the Republican Party agreed with him, they're basically saying, you know, the people who are holding office, you know, the person who is in the White House has no right to be there. That was calling into question the legitimacy of the system that we have, the political system. And so I think that creates a new kind of opportunity for far right groups who can look at these tens of millions of people who are suddenly saying, I don't necessarily believe in this political system that I've been part of. That creates openings for people to be pulled into other kinds of far right belief systems and activism. It's not necessarily going to happen to most people in that situation, but it is it's a different situation than what we had, and I think that the events of January 6th both resulted from that shift. They were able to have thousands of people descend on the the houses of Congress and attack them, and also it kind of sharpened or drew the battle lines much more sharply than they had been drawn before. People who participated in that event, have talked about how it was a kind of a transformative moment. And I think that more broadly, it certainly dramatized a crisis within the Republican Party. How did they relate to this this assault on the U.S. government? And more broadly, so there's a lot of questions now about what's going to happen with the relationship between the far right and this broader mass of Trump supporters going forward.